This is Questioning the Answers 9 Days and Tisha B'Av Edition. I'm Haber-Goldstein. This is my channel where we talk about all things Judaism, literally across the spectrum. And today we're talking about specifically Tisha B'Av, and specifically in this format because I know a lot of you are watching things today to get through the fast. So let's try to think of something that we can learn from today to make today actually meaningful and find some call to action that's applicable to our lives that will make this day actually affect us and not just pass us by. So anybody who knows me at all knows that I love going back to the sources. Anytime I learn anything, it's always from the original place where we originally learned about it or the first time that it happened. And with Tisha B'Av, there's no difference. We go back to the first Tisha B'Av that ever existed, which was in the time when the Jews were in the desert. They were about to enter the land of Israel, and they decided to send spies. So I'm looking at the source. I have it open on my screen. And we're reading the story of how the Jews decided that they were going to send some spies in to learn the lay of the land, to discuss some plans and strategy because they're about to wage war on the people in Israel. And Hashem's not actually so happy about this, but he's like, okay, you can send one person from each tribe, send them in. He's not so happy, but he allows it. They go in, they come back, and they have reports. And they say, yeah, God didn't lie. It's a beautiful land. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's green, it's lush, it's gorgeous. But the people there are gigantic. And the people there are strong. And we're like little tiny grasshoppers. We're going to die there. And the response is for all the Jews to start crying and begging and saying, why are we here? Why did you bring us here? It would have been better for us to die in Egypt. Would have been better for us to die in the desert than to die after all this by being squashed by giants like we're grasshoppers. And they even go so far as to start planning a trip back to Egypt, even trying to anoint a new leader that would take them back to Egypt. Like, this is the level of despair they got to. They were crying. And God looks at them and he says, who said you're going to die? Like, you're sitting here crying in despair because you view yourself as a grasshopper that's going to die by being squashed by a giant. But who said you're going to die? And he says, you know what? And this is like where people get into the whole idea that God is toxic. He says, you wanted to cry today over nothing? You will cry on this day every year for something real. And that day, today, has been an incredibly horrible day for the Jewish people ever since innumerable horrible things have happened. We've had both of our temples destroyed on this day. We've had horrible things in the Holocaust, in the Spanish Inquisition, in all the different wars. Today has been a horrible day for the Jewish nation on all accounts. And it's a little difficult to understand because it's almost like God is being like we said, very toxic, right? Like, I'll give you something real to cry about. So let's go back and read it from the source, because a lot of times growing up, we're told stories or lines are stuck in our head or assumptions are made that we don't necessarily align exactly with the story the way that it's written in the Torah. So it's always good to go back to the source and recenter and see exactly what Hashem said. So you're looking at Chumash Bamidbar in chapter 14, right? Perek Yudaled. V'tisa kol ha'eda, right? The entire community broke out into cries, and the people wept, and the Jews railed against Moshe and Aaron, and they said, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. And the whole community shouted at them, or if only we may die in this desert. And they're standing around Moshe and Aaron's tent, and they're yelling at Moshe and Aaron. And I think it's really powerful to read it from inside. They say, why is Hashem taking us to a land just so that we can be killed by the sword? Our wives and our children will be carried off. It would have been better for us to go back to Egypt. And then they look at each other and they say, yes, let's go back to Egypt. I'm reading it literally from inside. Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces before all of the Jews. And Yoshua ben Nun and Caleb, who were the two spies who said good things about Israel, rip their clothes. And the four of them tell the Jews, the land is an exceedingly good land. Hashem is pleased with us. Hashem loves us. He's going to bring us into this land that is flowing with milk and honey. He's going to give it to us, and you must not rebel against Hashem. And they're pleading with the people, don't do this. Don't get mad at Hashem. Don't yell at Hashem. Believe in him. He will be there. Have no fear of them. They have no protection. We have protection. And let's go into the land. And the entire Jewish nation's response is to pick up rocks and start throwing the rocks at Yoshua, at Kalev, at Moshe, at Aaron, at the Ohel Moed where Moshe would speak to Hashem. And they're throwing rocks, and the 4 of them are crying, and all the Jews are throwing rocks. And Hashem says to Moshe, how long are these people going to spurn me? How long will they have no faith in me? I have shown them so many signs that I am here for them, and they keep on doubting me. I'm going to kill them, I'm going to disown them, and I will make you a new nation. Which isn't the first time God said this to Moshe, by the way. Hashem's like, let me just make a new nation. And Moshe doesn't let. Moshe says, when the Egyptians, from who you freed these people, hear the news, they will tell it to everybody in the land. Everybody in the world knows that Hashem is protecting these people. And Hashem made the clouds of glory, and Hashem split the Yam Suf, and Hashem took them out of Egypt. If you kill these people, the nations of the world will say, it must be because Hashem was powerless to bring those people into the land, and He promised them that He's going to slaughter them in the wilderness, and it must be because the people in Israel are stronger than this God. So let me pray, and let me beg you, remember how kind you are, remember how slow to anger you are, remember how forgiving you are, right? He reads out the 13 attributes, and he says, please forgive these people, because you forgave the people in Egypt, you've been forgiving them until now, just please forgive them again, because this isn't going to end well if you kill them. And Hashem says, I will forgive them. Just like you asked, Salachti kedvarecha. I'm literally reading this inside, right? There's a lot of pieces that I was told that aren't necessarily here, but let's keep reading, maybe we'll find them, who knows. So Hashem says, I will forgive them, but nevertheless, these people have sinned. They're sitting here doubting me after everything I did for them. So those people who were involved are never going to go into Israel. They're never going to see the land of Israel. Besides for the 2 spies who said good things, everybody else is going to die in the desert. That's how they began their journey of 40 years of traveling through the desert, as one by one, those who cried and begged to go back to Egypt died, until all that was left was a new generation able to go into the land of Israel. And the Torah just moves on to the next story. Never in the Torah does the Torah actually say, I'm going to give you something real to cry about. So how do we know that this is the source? Even though we have a Masorah, we have a tradition that this happened on Tisha B'Av. So this is a day where calamity can happen. We don't actually have a source that this is the reason for Tisha B'Av. So something that I heard from a Rebbitzin, I don't even know her name, years ago, and it always stuck with me, was that it wasn't Hashem punishing us, oh, you cried over nothing, I'm going to give you something real to cry about, which is a sentence that isn't written in the Torah, which says a lot. But it was more that the Jewish nation as a whole had almost a personality or a personality trait where they didn't see themselves as who they really were. They were the children of Hashem. They were the chosen nation. They had just been taken out of Egypt with miraculous, crazy, insane miracles. And they still didn't believe in themselves. They still didn't believe in their value and who they were and what they were capable of or what was capable of happening to them. They still saw themselves as grasshoppers against giants. They didn't see themselves as giants, right? As strong people. And it was like Hashem is saying, or they're saying, or Moshe is saying, as long as you see yourself as a grasshopper and you don't see yourself or your self-worth, you're not going to be able to go into the land of Israel. You're not going to be able to accomplish what you're meant to accomplish. You're not going to be able to win, so to speak, to be who you're meant to be, because you still view yourself as so dang small. And you are not seeing yourself for who you really are. And that's why, no matter what God gave them, the Beis HaMikdash, the 10 Commandments, whatever it was that God gave them, it always didn't last, because you can have all the things around you. You can have the miracles, and you can have the objects, and you can have the land, and you can have the respect. But if you don't believe in it, if you still think that you're a grasshopper, no matter what anybody else says or does, you're going to act like a grasshopper, and you're not going to be able to maintain whatever it is that you're given. So when we're on Tisha B'Av and we're sitting here with this idea in our head of like, we cried because we didn't believe in the capabilities of who we are, of who, we're God's children, of what God can do for us. We didn't believe in Him, in us, in each other. So that's why we're here today, and that's why we keep on continuing to be here. And what can we do? How can we get out of this so that we can have the complete Geula and the full Mashiach, right? And this is where the second part comes in. Everything that we do is very constructive, at least in my world. Every time that we do something, it's with a purpose, it's with a meaning. We don't just do things because. That's not the Jewish way. Everything has thousands of hidden meanings and stuff that every single rabbi has a different share. And like, I'm sure this is not the only video you're watching on Tisha B'Av, and I'm sure everybody's giving you a different way to apply today into your life. We don't do things just because. So how do we make our morning, today is a day of mourning, how do we make our morning constructive? And this is something that I heard from Rabbi Foreman, and who I love his videos, and I love what he does, and I think that there's so much logic to it that my brain just loves it. And he says, okay, if we're going to have constructive mourning, right? We're sitting here, we're feeling like grasshoppers, we're trying to get out of it, we're trying to understand what we can do to make it that next year is a year of Geula. What is it that we can do? What can we do that's actually constructive? And his response is, well, who was the person in Tanakh who had constructive mourning? Like, who cried constructive tears? And we can learn from her. And the obvious answer is Rachel, right? Rachel Imenu, as the Jews were leaving Israel, as the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Jews are walking out of Israel, and they walk past Kever Rachel, right? As they're leaving Jerusalem, they walk past Rachel Imenu's Kever, her grave. And she, and all there's like a whole long medrash of all the things that were happening in Shemayim at this time. The Jews are leaving Israel, and Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov are begging Hashem, please, I did this. I almost sacrificed my son. I did this. I did that. Please forgive the Jewish nation. Forgive the Jewish nation. And Hashem's like, no. And they even went and they didn't know where Moshe was buried, so they went and they had to find Moshe's grave to go and ask Moshe to come intervene, because in the past when he had intervened and asked Hashem to forgive, Hashem had listened to him, but it doesn't work. Hashem says, no, enough. They've done enough. I'm not forgiving them. Until Rachel Imenu gets up and she says, and she's crying, and she says her whole story, and Hashem says, okay, stop crying, because she, and the words are yesh sachar lefuratech, right? There is a reward for your actions, and because of you, I'm going to bring the Jews home. Eventually, the Jews will come back home, and 70 years later, they go back to Israel. And Hashem doesn't say there's a reward for your crying. Hashem says there's a reward for your actions. And Rabbi Foreman says yesh sachar is yisaschar, and we can see what Hashem is referring to when Hashem says your actions by looking at the story of Yisaschar. Everybody knows that Rachel Imenu gave her the signs to Yaakov at the day of her wedding when Yaakov was poised to marry Rachel. Lavan didn't want Rachel to marry Yaakov. He wanted Leah to marry Yaakov. And on the night of the wedding, he performed a switch. Yaakov was married to Leah. Rachel and Yaakov had signs between them to make sure that wouldn't happen. Rachel gave those signs to Leah so that Leah wouldn't be embarrassed. And Yaakov marries Leah and then works another 7 years to marry Rachel. And everybody says that this is the story of why Hashem listened to her. But happens to be that Rabbi Foreman disagrees. He says this isn't the story. Rachel didn't really have much to do with that story. She didn't agree to the switch. She didn't agree to what was happening. She's not even mentioned in the Torah during that story. She's not mentioned. She's by herself in a room, but she just happened to do something to make sure her sister wasn't embarrassed. But we don't even know that. That's all medrash. That's not in the Torah. Let's look in the Torah at something that Rachel did do, where she's actually mentioned in the Torah, and let's look at the story of Yisaschar, right? So we know that they get married, and after 7 years, Rachel and Yaakov get married, and Leah is having baby after baby after baby, and Rachel is just waiting and waiting and waiting, and we still don't hear anything negative that Rachel is feeling. However, after Leah has 4 children, Rachel says, okay, I'm jealous, right? And the Torah tells us that Rachel is jealous. And Rachel's really struggling. And she goes and she says to Yaakov, okay, here, have my maidservant. Have my maidservant. You'll have 2 children through her. And I'll at least have somebody to raise. Yaakov has a baby through the maidservants. She has two babies through the maidservants, and Rachel calls them Dan and Naphtali, which is like justifying my struggle. And she's like, okay, Hashem has like said that Hashem has validated me and gave me these two babies. And she's like mediocrely happy. But then Leah turns around and gives Yaakov her maidservant, and her maidservant has two babies as well. And now Rachel's like, okay, like I just can't win. And it's just like she felt like Hashem, like almost like the validation was taken away from her. And this is where Rachel starts getting very bitter. She says, give me children or I'm going to die. And Yaakov's like, what am I, God? Like, I can't give you children. What do you want for my life? I'm able to have children. You're obviously the issue. Like, why are you yelling at me? And Rachel is just completely depressed and despondent. And then one day, Leah's oldest son is 12, and he's walking around and he finds some flowers, some weeds. The Torah doesn't tell us what kind of flowers they are. They just are some pretty flowers that Reuben picks and brings back to his mom. Now, a lot of people try to say that these are fertility flowers. What Rashi actually says and what the Torah says is that they were just pretty flowers that Reuben was bringing to show love towards his mom. And Rachel was jealous of that love. She was like, I don't have a child who can come and give me that love. And she was jealous of the love. And she goes over to Leah and she says, well, you have the child, like give me the flowers. Let me at least enjoy something from children. And Leah looks at her and says, you already took the love of my husband. Why are you trying to take the love of my child? And she's like, what is wrong with you? And it's in that moment that Rachel has this clarity of seeing Leah's side, of seeing, oh my gosh, like this is a crazy story. And she realizes that nobody's at fault. Yaakov's not at fault. Leah's not at fault, right? She's like, they're just going through their own struggles over here. So the sisters come up with this agreement to exchange a night with Yaakov for the flowers from Reuven, which is a weird agreement. Like it's just a strange agreement. And Leah goes out and she tells Yaakov that it's her night with him, and they go and they have Yisachar. This is the reward is that Leah gets Yisachar. So what is happening here, right? So I want to suggest something that I heard from a third source. I don't know who it was. It was just an article that I read, that Rachel was basically saying, I understand that Yaakov's not going to be able to give me a child. And I understand that Leah is not going to be able to give me the love of a child. I understand that the only person who can give me a child is Hashem. And she stops asking she stops asking Leah for things. She stops asking Yaakov for a child. And she turns around and she says, how can I help myself? And she even gives Leah her night with Yaakov as if she's saying, like, this has nothing to do with Yaakov. Yaakov can't give me this child. And she turns around and she's crying. She says, and she's davening to Hashem, and she's rewarded with Yosef and Binyamin. And when she sat there and cried, Alba Nehakienenu, when the Jews were leaving Israel, she's not saying, I'm crying for my children who are leaving Israel now. I'm crying on my children that I didn't have. When she was sitting there before Yosef and Binyamin were born, she was crying to Hashem about the children that she didn't have. She gave up Yaakov. She gave up her validation of justice to her sister. And she said, I'm going to give that up and I'm going to turn around and I'm going to help myself. I'm not going to go through other people. I'm not going to wait for somebody else to come and save me. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to say to Hashem, I don't have children. Give me children. And Hashem says, okay, and gives her two children. And this is how, for me, this all connected together from three different things that I was listening to about Tisha B'Av, where we were crying because we saw ourselves as grasshoppers. The generation in the desert saw themselves as grasshoppers. Generation of the temple saw themselves as grasshoppers. Every generation sees themselves as we're so small, we're so insignificant, we're so weak, we can't win, we just cry. And we're sitting and we're waiting for somebody to come and save us, right? For Mashiach to come and save us, for somebody to come bring us back home. But what if we have to do what Rachel did? And what if we have to say, I'm not going to wait for you to give me a child. I'm not going to wait for you to save me. I'm not going to wait for you to validate me. I'm going to take care of it myself. I'm going to stop being a grasshopper and I'm going to do what I need to do to get what I want to get or need to get. And in Rachel's case, it was turning around and davening to Hashem, but in everybody's case, that's something different. But turning around and finding that inner peace, finding our personal Mashiach, right? Or Moshe Weinberger talks about our Mashiach Katan. Each person has their own personal Mashiach in their own personal world, and then on a global national scale, there's a general national Mashiach, right? If we can turn around, then we can take that grasshopper feeling and turn it into a giant feeling and say, I'm not going to spend Tisha B'Av crying, waiting for somebody to come and save me, but I'm going to spend Tisha B'Av reflecting on how I have been relying on other people or waiting for other people to come save me, and what it is that I can do for myself that will save myself, that will help me find my inner Mashiach, my inner peace, my personal redemption. And if we do that, then 6 days later, on the 15th of Av, it says in the Gemara, it's the happiest day of the year. It says in the Gemara that when we enter Av, we reduce the amount of joy we have. But then it says right away, right next to it, like the next paragraph, it says the 15th of Av is the happiest day in the Jewish nation. So how is the happiest day in the Jewish nation in the saddest month of the year, the month that we reduce joy? Because if we use Tisha B'Av to actually start finding our personal redemption, we can merit to have the happiest day in the year. We can merit to have Tu B'Av, where the girls went out and they danced. And the men were like, I want to be part of that. I want that. But the girls weren't like, let me go wait for a man to find me. No, they went out. They danced. They were happy. And they even were there for each other in a way that they had never been there for each other before. If you read the whole story, which is a whole nother video, which we can do on the 15th of Av. But if we can spend this Tisha B'Av thinking about what it is that we can do to find our own personal redemption, to stop relying on somebody to save us, to stop relying on somebody to help us, to stop relying on somebody to validate us, and instead to do what Rachel did and turn around and say, what can I do to find my Mashiach Katan, my inner redemption, and to go ahead and start doing that. If we each find our own personal redemption on a national scale, we'll be able to have a national redemption. But we each have to be ready for it. We each have to be able to say in ourselves that we are ready for that personal redemption. And that's how I connect this year to Tisha B'Av. And I hope that gives you something applicable to focus on today. Have an easy fast.